Welcome to this Q&A episode of Talking Politics. Robert joins me to work our way through your questions. He is at home on holiday, so we're very privileged that he's joined us. Let's start with a question from Alex Martin on Facebook. How significant are the local elections as a test for reform? I'd say two things about this. One, I think it's interesting that Reform's poll rating has now been very consistent at 24-25%. for really quite a long time. And if I was the Tory party, I would be beginning to get worried that there is a possibility that Reform is going to possibly supplant them as the main opposition party. I always think that's an exaggerated possibility, but certainly to split the vote so badly that it becomes very, very difficult for the Tories to win an election. All that said, the only thing I would say about local elections, having covered many of them as Robert has, is that they're notoriously not a very good test of what's going to happen in a general election, which of course is still many years away. Robert?
This is an opportunity for people to make a protest vote. It would be surprising if Reform didn't do pretty well, particularly since these are local elections where the comparator year was a year in which the Tories did pretty well, and also for a variety of sort of semi-accidental reasons. Actually, there are not many parts of the country being contested where Labour is traditionally strong, so pretty much all the focus will be on how well Reform does relative to the Tories. And right now it looks as though the Tories are likely to be quite close to humiliated and Reform do quite well. However, we are years away from a general election. I mean, Kemi Badenoch, if that does happen, will be under a bit of pressure from her own party. I think they'd be mad to dump her at this juncture because we're still quite a long way from a general election and she's got to be given a bit more time to be tested. I think, weirdly, there is a potential silver lining both for the Tories and for Labour if Reform pick up a lot of seats, because this will be an opportunity for them, for all of us, to assess whether they're competent or not, right? If Reform wins a load of seats and it turns out that their councillors are absolutely useless, that would be the best possible evidence for the Tories that voters should come back to them. So, Farage not only has to win in respect of, just essentially being a great campaigner, he's got to turn, this is the first time in his career where he's got to actually turn his army of supporters and anybody who gets elected into something that looks credible as a party of government, and the first test will be whether they look credible in local government.
Okay, Chris Smith emailed asking, is Ed Miliband's multi-billion-pound spending to achieve net zero carbon emissions by the next election justified in the current economic climate? This has got breaching impartiality for Robert and I written all over it, because I guess it's a controversial subject. It probably depends on your assessment of the threat posed by the climate and the potential economic impacts of what Ed Miliband is doing. Robert, do you want to pitch into this one?
Yeah, look, there are so many aspects of this. I mean, the big charge of Badenoch and Farage is that the timetable to achieve net zero is producing power at the moment that is too expensive for British businesses, and it is holding back economic growth and damaging British businesses. And there is something to that argument, although, to be clear, having looked at this in some detail, I would say two things. A lot of the costs of the renewables are actually stem from really bad deals that were done by governments 15 or so years ago, whether it's subsidies for solar panels on people's houses, whether it's the initial deals on wind farms, all done at ludicrously uncompetitive rates. And then there is a second issue, which is how we pay for the transition to net zero, which is largely through costs heaped on all our bills, including the bills of energy, of corporate business energy users, apart from the biggest energy users. And there is a very strong argument for saying one of the reasons as a country we have relatively high energy costs, and that is bad for the economy, is because we are paying for the transition customers are paying for the transition, whereas you could argue it'd be much better if the government paid for it through the tax system and basically socialized the cost in that way. But then there's a final thing, which is we are just too dependent on gas, right? We are too dependent on gas. It is the gas price that sets the marginal cost of all energy at the moment, including what the suppliers of renewable energy get. We've got to wean ourselves off gas. Why does French businesses pay way less for energy than we do? It's because they got nuclear. The biggest mistake that successive governments made in the UK was not to invest in nuclear. And the problem now is we're way behind the curve and it'll take years to catch up.
Kenneth on YouTube wrote, "Trade is trade. Why should allies get special treatment when they are some of the worst offenders on taking advantage of America on trade?" Sounds like a question that could have been written by Donald Trump, but, fair enough, fair question. I'm not sure I entirely understand the concept of allies taking advantage of America on trade. I understand that's the MAGA argument. I don't really understand the logic to it. There are certainly those people who suggest that having a trade surplus the wrong way round with other countries can be detrimental to the long term of your economy, but people seem to be split on the arguments about that. Robert, this is your specialist subject. What do you think? So I'm going to leave you to answer this one.
Look, in a relatively free trading economy, you get countries that behave in a, I suppose, a respectable way and fight fair. And then there are countries that, deploy tactics that you would regard as unfair. So, on the whole, I think you would regard, we are a very open economy in the UK. I don't think we, on the whole, take advantage of other countries in the way that we trade. China, you would argue, over a period of decades, did employ some unfair trading tactics, massive subsidies to particular industries, a manipulation of its currency so that Chinese goods seemed, were more competitive than they would otherwise have been if they'd had free floating currency and indeed free capital flows. So, the argument, the argument against China that and these are arguments that have been made for years, including by the European Union, by the way, not just by, Trump's America, that China uses unfair competitive practices, have been around for most of our adult lives, Tom. That is nonetheless a different argument from has America benefited from the massive Chinese surplus, or has it paid an enormous price as a result of the massive Chinese surplus? I mean, one of the things to point out is that the money that China has accumulated from its surplus with America has largely been invested in American assets, and that has kept interest rates lower in America than they would otherwise have been. It has allowed for a more buoyant American economy than would otherwise have been the case. It has encouraged America to move up the value chain, so that in digital, it is now absolutely incomparably the world leader. And so even if you think that China is engaged in unfair practices, and I think that's perfectly reasonable, it's also completely reasonable to say, America has, done pretty well out of that rigged trading system. But America also does well, as, all importers do well, when China can make the stuff that we like way cheaper than our own companies can make. That's a massive boost to the standard of living of consumers in places like the UK and the US. So, many would say Trump starts from a very odd place in saying that China has really massively undermined, America's economic strength. Now, there is one aspect of what's happened in America, and it's also happened in Europe, that is, I would agree with Trump. It's been bad, right? That, very large numbers of Americans who had decent manufacturing jobs lost those jobs. They didn't, and this is also true of, people in the Northeast and Northwest and Midlands, what we now call the Rust Belt of this country, of America, or of France. Those people feel that globalization, the rise of China, has been bad for them, and they're right, it has been bad for them. But if you have an economy like America that has been growing at the rate that it has, what any sensible leader would recognize is there are enormous resources available to lift up those people by helping them to gain new skills, by making sure the welfare system lifts their living standards, by changing the tax system so that it helps them. The failure in America has been of basically social tax redistributive policy. The failure of America has been the enormous amount of the fruits of American growth that went to a tiny number of people at the top, the billionaires, whether it's the Musks or even Trump himself. And so, what is sort of one of the most surreal aspects of the Trump-induced crisis that has flown from his attempt to change the terms of trade is that he is undermining a system that actually made people like himself egregiously wealthy. And it would have been much more sensible just to have a debate in America about how do we make sure that our fast-growing economy doesn't just benefit the super rich, doesn't just benefit Elon Musk and, Trump's cabinet.
John Harris on Facebook asks, is the government doing enough to protect workers and businesses affected by Trump's tariffs? I would say possibly not. I think you would want to see the government acting maybe a little bit swifter. I think it's doing some of the right things, but acting a bit swifter in terms of, for example, as Robert and I have repeatedly talked about, improving the trading conditions with Europe, doing the trade deal if one is at all possible, with the US as quickly as possible. But most importantly, as Robert has talked about, reaching out to the coalition of the willing, other leading democracies, leading economies around the world to make sure that we're reducing trade barriers there as they go up with the US. Robert, anything to add?
No, I mean, I think there's the let's try and improve the terms of trade as fast as possible with other rich countries, and in fact with all countries, not just rich countries, right? So let's try and make it easier for our exporters if it's now much more expensive to sell to America, make it cheaper for them to sell elsewhere. That's vital. But also let's unlock British capital so that it invests in Britain. One of the scandals of the UK is that our pension funds and our big investors invest almost everywhere but the UK. Rachel Reeves has set it as an ambition to channel more British saving to productive British businesses. The leading British investment institutions have signed up to that in something called the Mansion House Compact. As yet, it has led to negligible flows of British money to British businesses. We need British investors to be more patriotic and to think more positively about the prospects of British companies, and the government should be, by a mixture of carrot and stick, massively accelerating that process. So that they're not moving fast enough in that sense.
Finally, we had this testing delivery. See what I did there? From Sam Richardson on email, who wrote, Jimmy Anderson took 700 wickets to earn his knighthood. What did Grant Shapps do to earn his... Well, he had every single job in cabinet. So I suppose there's that. I don't know what you say to this. I don't know what to make of our honours system, quite honestly. Sometimes you're sitting there watching the telly and you're watching someone getting an honour and you think, oh, that's so great. For example, Sir Alan Bates gets his knighthood. What an amazing thing. That just felt so uplifting, so fantastic, so great that the country could honour somebody who'd just been... I feel like Alan Bates was a sort of personification of what most people in this country would consider as great British values, sort of determination, stoicism, integrity, decency, etc., etc., etc. And having an honours system that rewards someone like that feels very uplifting. On the other hand, there are so many honours, a lot of them political honours, but not entirely restricted to that, where you think, I mean, come on. Of course, Robert and I are old enough to remember the whole cash for honours scandal. We were talking earlier in the week of things that you overhear at lunch. I remember when I was political editor running a story about what was going on in that investigation that I'd overheard, that someone had told me at lunch in a very, very noisy restaurant. And I then had the whole government, Tony Blair and Al, attacking me in my story, saying it was completely false, and spending the week thinking, oh my God, did I mishear that at lunch? It was a very loud restaurant and all the rest of it. It turned out much later that I hadn't. Getting off track a bit here. But Robert, do you have a view on Sir Grant Shapps?
What I think is this. Okay, so I've got a number of views. One is, it is definitely the case that the whole system has been brought into disrepute by just the sheer number of what you might call, whether they're political jobs worths or business jobs worths, who get pretty high honours. And I don't think it reflects well on our country. I think, it would be way better if we had an honour system that much more reflected our community's view of genuine public service, or just of greatness, right? So I don't know. I think Paul McCartney is probably the most important contributor to British culture alive today. And I can't remember whether he got the Order of Merit. I think he's definitely got the Companion of Honour, which are these two top honours that reward just greatness, right? I think it's fantastic that he has got one of those honours, because, as I say, I struggle to think of a single individual alive in this country today who has contributed more to the richness of our culture and our sense of who we are. So when people like that get honours, I just think, that's fantastic, right? But I'm not going to name names. There are other people, for example, who've got the Companion of Honour, where you just think, what, what's that about? And that is, so even those honours, which are supposed to be less political, have to an extent been brought into disrepute. And I wish that we could reform the system so that, we could just get back to, I mean, maybe it was never like this, actually, if you just go back to, I don't know, something like the Lloyd George, honours scandal. Truthfully, the problem is when you have honours, they are always vulnerable to corruption and venality. I'm being naive in hoping that we can ever have a truly clean system, because weirdly, it's one of the weird things about people's psychology. Genuinely don't get why, let's just say you're a big business person of some sort, you've made a fortune, you've got to the top of your institution, you've probably got the respect of your community, and yet you're desperate for some flipping honour. Why? You've got everything that most people in life would regard as important. So what is that all about? Is that, you sort of think these people must have some great vacuum in their souls that somehow, being called Sir something or other makes all that difference. Bloody weird.
Thankfully, I think we can agree there is no chance whatsoever of either of us being awarded.
Nation breathes a sigh of relief.
Yeah. Listen, thank you all for your questions. Keep them coming. talkingpolitics@itv.com, or reply to any of our social posts. I'll be back on Monday with our first Q&A special with the Talking Politics USA team, including answers on everything from the future of gun laws to whether the White House is weaponizing artificial intelligence. So if you're listening or watching this on a podcast platform or YouTube, then please do hit subscribe to ensure you get that and every other episode. If you're listening to this over Easter, have a great Easter. If you're listening beyond that, I hope you had a great Easter, and I will see you in the course of next week. Goodbye.